Mom by Samantha Lavis. Most single parents are single mothers. In 2013, 77% of single parents were single mothers, and 85% of the children living with a single parent were living with their mother. My mother was a single parent, and I remember being raised by her. My mother has always been a rock, or should I say, my mother's always been my rock, always telling me to never give up and to always stand tall. I remember her washing the dishes. I also knew that every time she did the dishes, it was to drown out the sound of her crying because she felt that she always had to be strong. She didn't want us kids to have to hear her crying. I remember her standing there with her hands on her hips telling me, "Don't ever let a man take care of you, Samantha. You need to depend on yourself so that no one can ever rip the floor out from underneath you." My parents divorced when I was pretty young, and there were 3 of us kids, which meant 3 mouths to feed. My mom always made sure that there was a roof over our heads, food on the table, and clothes on our backs. Looking back now, I never really realized that my mother was molding us into what she had always wanted for us, to be able to hold our heads high, to be able to pay for ourselves at dinner, and to never let a man or anyone for that matter tell us no. My mother worked 3 jobs for as long as I can remember, and with 3 mouths to feed, it wasn't always the easiest. In 2012, median income for single mother families was $25,493. There were plenty of times that we'd come home and she was tired from working 2 to 3 jobs at a time. I was a latchkey kid, so most of the time I was coming home from school to an empty house. There were plenty of times that I'd come home to no lights on because the electricity was cut off, but my mom never let that faze me, and there were a few times that she couldn't afford to pay rent. I can always remember seeing bills on the table, past due. At the age of 12, I became a pro at breaking into houses, and by that I mean my own house. My mother couldn't always afford to pay rent. One day we came home and posted boldly for everyone to see was an eviction notice on our door. My mother didn't even wince. She looked at me and said in that stern mom voice, "Well, kid, get ready to climb." My mother hoisted me into the window, and then I remember quietly crawling on the floor as to not make any noise and let anyone know that we were there. We had to be quiet. If a neighbor heard us there, they might report us, and then we'd be out on the street. I crawled down the stairs, making sure to duck below windows, out of sight like a spy dodging a secret alarm system, and unlocked the door. I was proud of myself, while my mom, that night, she didn't cry while doing dishes. She cried while laying in her room in the complete dark. My mother always lived by her words. That was until I was 20 years old, and I was living on my own. My mother had been seeing a man named Jay for as long as I could remember. Even when my parents were still married, she had been with Jay. I remember that it was the winter, because there was snow on the ground. It was late at night, about 2:30 in the morning, when I heard a frantic knocking on the door. I opened the door slowly and found my mother there, holding her head. She was shivering and blood was encrusted around her nose. I'll never forget reaching to grab the back of my mother's head and feeling what felt like a grapefruit-sized lump on the back of her head. Jay had beat her and nearly killed her this time. She was sobbing and just kept saying she was sorry over and over again. I can still feel the rage I felt that night. I wanted to rip Jay's eyes from his head. I wanted to do exactly to him what he had done to my mother, and I still do to this day. He beat her like a dog, and days later, I remember going back to her house that she had shared with him to scavenge whatever we could before he returned. I caught my mother crying by the sink. As she looked down, she told me how he had kicked her in her stomach while she was down. My mother managed to stay away from Jay for some months, but for years she would return to him, only to leave him months later because of his uncontrollable rage. Many women who are abused by their partners don't leave right away, or sometimes at all. Some women don't leave out of fear. Others have children with their families, or don't have the funds to leave, or feel so worthless from years of abuse that they deem themselves unlovable by anyone else's standards. How could this woman that I looked up to, that I thought was so strong, be so weak for this man, a simple man? She always made me look down on men and almost pity them for being less superior to women, and here she was, falling for his bullshit tears and empty promises. She wasn't the rock I thought she was, until I struggled with the same fact. She's still my hero, but looking back on what Jay had done to her, might have saved my life. Years later, I was involved in an abusive relationship, and the night my face was slammed against my wooden floor was the night I remember holding that grapefruit-sized lump on the back of my mother's head. A rage awoke in me, and I realized I couldn't become what my mother had become. I needed to prove to her that I could be strong for the both of us. When I awoke the next morning on the bathroom floor, I knew that man had to go, and I told him to leave my house before I called the cops. I remember clutching my phone fearfully and felt myself shake until he left. I ran to the door, locking out what I had allowed in. What happened to me in turn had helped my mother. She realized that she couldn't lead by example the way she always had if she had stayed with Jay, and so she told him he had to go. My mother and I still discuss these moments, and every time she tells me how, in the end, she looked up to me, and how I was now her hero.